This is an ejection seat. It fires once, saves one life, and costs more than a Ferrari. From the moment a pilot pulls the handle, 30 separate mechanical events must execute in sequence. Get the timing wrong by 50 milliseconds, and the seat doesn't save the pilot. It becomes the thing that kills them. The handle is yellow and black striped, and every pilot who has ever sat in a military cockpit knows exactly what pulling it means. It is the last resort. The final admission that the aircraft is lost, and the only question remaining is whether the person inside it survives the next 4 seconds. But before that handle ever gets pulled, before the sequence even begins, someone spent years making sure that what happens next doesn't kill the pilot faster than the emergency itself. An ejection seat looks, at first glance, like an aggressively overbuilt office chair. It has a seat pan, a back, armrests, and a headrest. What it also has hidden inside its frame and beneath its cushions is a precisely sequenced set of explosive charges, rocket motors, sensors, timers, and deployment mechanisms that have to execute in the right order, at the right speed, every single time. There is no second attempt. The seat fires once. Everything has to work on that one firing. The Martin Baker Mark 16, one of the most common seats currently in service, weighs roughly 207 pounds, about the same as a full-grown male black bear. That weight sits directly behind the pilot at all times, held to the cockpit floor by rails and a series of locking mechanisms designed to release in a specific sequence. The seat doesn't simply launch upward. It follows the rails first, then clears them, and then the rocket pack takes over. Each phase hands off to the next. A failure in the handoff means the sequence stops, and a sequence that stops halfway through is worse than one that never started. The engineering problem at the core of ejection seat design is not how do we get the pilot out. That part is straightforward. Explosive force directed upward. The actual problem is the range. The seat has to work at 0 airspeed on a runway at sea level. It has to work at 600 knots at 40,000 feet. It has to work if the aircraft is inverted. It has to work if the pilot weighs 103 pounds or 245 pounds. That is not one engineering problem. That is dozens of them, solved simultaneously, packed into a frame the size of a recliner. Where the first component in the sequence is the ejection gun, a telescoping catapult built into the seat's spine. When the handle is pulled, a firing cartridge ignites and drives the seat up the rails at an acceleration between 14 and 20 times the force of gravity. To understand what 18G feels like in a fraction of a second, consider that a car crash at 35 miles per hour generates roughly 30G across several hundred milliseconds. The ejection gun delivers its force in under 0.1 seconds. The human spine, specifically the vertebrae between T4 and T5, has a compression fracture threshold that this force approaches. Too weak a charge and the seat doesn't clear the aircraft's tail. The pilot survives the ejection and dies on impact with the vertical stabilizer. Too powerful and the pilot clears the tail with a spine that will never fully recover. But this is why the ejection envelope exists. Every seat has a published chart, a curve plotted against airspeed and altitude, that defines the combinations where the seat can save a pilot's life. Inside the envelope, survivable. Outside it, the physics simply don't cooperate. A pilot ejecting at very high speed at very low altitude may be outside the envelope entirely, meaning the seat will fire correctly and the pilot will still not survive. The seat does everything right. The situation does not allow for a good outcome. Before the seat even moves, one event has to happen first. The canopy has to go. A pilot cannot eject through a closed canopy and survive. On most modern aircraft, pulling the ejection handle triggers canopy jettisons simultaneously. A set of explosive bolts fires and the canopy is blown free. The entire jettison sequence takes under 0.3 seconds. If it runs long, the seat is already moving. A seat hitting a canopy that hasn't fully cleared generates forces the human neck was not designed to absorb. The leg restraint system activates at the same moment the catapult fires. At high airspeeds, a pilot's legs, if unsecured, will be thrown backward by wind blast, with enough force to fracture both femurs before the pilot has even left the aircraft. Thin cables attached to the pilot's ankles retract automatically, pulling the legs tight against the seat pan. The retraction has to complete before the seat clears the cockpit opening. The timing margin is measured in tens of milliseconds. The seat has been sitting dormant in that cockpit for potentially years, maintained, inspected, repacked on schedule, but never tested under live conditions. Every component has a service life. Every explosive charge has a certified expiration. The people responsible for keeping that seat ready will never know if they got it right until the moment it matters most, and by then, they won't be in the room. The canopy is already gone by the time the pilot's brain registers that the handle has been pulled. The sequence is already 3 steps ahead of human perception, and the pilot, for the next 0.3 seconds, is not making any decisions. The seat's mechanical sequencer is making all of them. In the first 100 milliseconds after handle pull, 4 things happen in order. The canopy jettisons, the leg restraints retract, the ejection gun fires, the seat begins moving up the rails. These 4 events are not triggered by separate switches or pilot inputs. They are triggered by each other, in a chain, each one mechanically unlocking the next. The pilot initiates the chain by pulling the handle. After that, the pilot is cargo. The ejection gun drives the seat up the rails at forces that compress the intervertebral discs like a stack of wet cardboard being stepped on. The acceleration peaks, and then the seat clears the top of the rails, at which point the rocket pack ignites. The transition between gun and rocket has to be seamless. A gap in thrust, even for 20 milliseconds, allows the seat to begin tumbling. A tumbling seat at the moment of rocket ignition delivers its thrust vector sideways instead of upward. The pilot exits the aircraft horizontally into whatever is beside them, which at 400 knots is effectively a wall of air traveling at 460 miles per hour, roughly the wind force you would feel standing in front of a running jet engine at close range. The rocket pack itself burns for approximately 0.2 seconds. In that time, it adds between 60 and 80 feet of altitude above the aircraft's ejection point. 60 feet sounds like nothing. At 0 altitude on a runway, it is the difference between enough sky for the parachute to inflate and not enough. The burn time is calibrated to the pilot's weight. Heavier pilots need more thrust to reach the same altitude. The seat's sensing system reads a weight cartridge set during pre-flight. Too light a setting for a heavy pilot, and the rocket burns out too early, leaving insufficient altitude. A too heavy a setting for a light pilot, and the seat overshoots its optimal deployment altitude, wasting energy and increasing the time the pilot spends in free fall. Here is what the pilot doesn't know. By the time they feel themselves moving, 4 things have already happened, and the most violent part, the part that compresses the spine and snaps the head forward, is already over. What the pilot experiences consciously begins around 150 milliseconds in. The wind hits first. At 400 knots, the blast is not a rush of air. It is a physical force that flattens the face against the skull and makes breathing feel like trying to inhale through a wet blanket pressed over the mouth. Exposed skin at that speed suffers abrasion damage in under a second. This is why modern ejection seats include face curtains and why helmets are not optional equipment. The drogue gun fires next, a small ballistic charge that deploys a stabilizing parachute roughly 18 inches in diameter, about the size of a large pizza. This drogue chute does not slow the pilot down significantly. That is not its job. Its job is to stop the seat from tumbling. A tumbling seat wraps parachute risers around itself, collapses the main canopy, and turns a survivable ejection into a fatal one. The drogue chute arrests rotation and holds the seat in a stable, nose-up attitude, while the main deployment sequence arms itself. The timing of drogue deployment is controlled by a barostat, a pressure-sensitive device that reads altitude. At high altitude, the barostat delays main parachute deployment, holding the pilot in free fall until reaching a breathable altitude. Descending through 15,000 feet at high speed without oxygen causes hypoxia in under 2 minutes, confusion, loss of fine motor control, and eventually unconsciousness. This is why high-altitude ejection seats carry a personal oxygen supply. A small bottle, roughly the size of a 2-litre soda bottle, delivers enough oxygen for approximately 10 minutes, long enough to descend to breathable air, but not long enough to make poor decisions about when to breathe. The aircraft, meanwhile, is gone. It has continued along its last flight path, forward or downward or both. The pilot is now a separate object in the sky, decelerating from aircraft speed towards something the parachute can manage. The seat is still attached. The main chute has not yet deployed. And the pilot is falling at a rate that feels, in the absence of visual reference, like nothing at all. This is the most dangerous moment of the ejection that doesn't feel dangerous. Everything is still to be decided. The drogue chute has done its job. The seat is stable, oriented correctly, falling at a controlled rate through air that may be thin enough to cause unconsciousness before the sequence finishes. Now comes the part that actually determines whether the pilot reaches the ground alive. The seat has to let go, and the parachute has to open. And these two things have to happen in exactly the right order. Seat pilot separation is triggered by a time-release mechanism called the time-release unit, or TRU, working in conjunction with the barostat. The TRU counts elapsed seconds from ejection. The barostat confirms altitude. When both conditions are satisfied, enough time has passed, and the altitude is low enough for a survivable parachute opening, the seat fires a separation charge. A metal connector at the base of the pilot's harness releases. The seat falls away beneath the pilot, descending separately. The pilot's harness, still connected to the parachute pack on their back, is now the only thing left. The main parachute has a deployment speed envelope. Open it above approximately 250 knots and the canopy fabric, rated for significant forces but not unlimited ones, tears along the gore seams. The result is a partial canopy that provides some drag but not enough to survive impact. Open it below 250 knots and the canopy inflates correctly, decelerating the pilot from freefall velocity to a survivable landing speed of roughly 17 feet per second, about the same force as jumping off a 10-foot wall onto hard ground. Survivable, not comfortable. By this point, most people assume the hard part is over. It isn't. The seat separation charge has to fire completely and the seat has to fall clear before the pilot's parachute begins inflating. If the seat is still attached, or even partially attached, its 207-pound weight collapses the parachute risers, the way a bowling ball dropped onto a bed sheet would collapse the fabric, pulling the canopy into itself before it can generate lift. A seat-entangled parachute deployment has a fatality rate that is not published in the manufacturer's literature because the number does not help anyone. Now the canopy opens. What the deceleration is not gradual, it is immediate, a single sharp jolt that loads the harness straps across the pilot's shoulders and groin at forces equivalent to a car hitting a concrete barrier at roughly 25 miles per hour, compressed into approximately 0.3 seconds. The shoulder straps leave bruises that take weeks to resolve. Pilots who have experienced successful ejections consistently describe the canopy opening as the moment they understood, physically and not just intellectually, that the seat had actually worked. The parachute opens. The wind stops shrieking. The temperature, which at altitude may have been negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, is now simply cold rather than lethal. Everything is quiet in a way that feels wrong after the violence of the last 3 seconds. The physical damage inventory begins here. Even a textbook ejection, everything working correctly, all sequences nominal, typically results in compression fractures in one or more thoracic vertebrae. The ejection gun's acceleration is designed to stay below the spinal fracture threshold, but the threshold varies by individual, by posture at the moment of ejection, and by the exact millisecond timing of the peak load. Pilots who eject with poor posture, slumped, rotated, or leaning, absorb the force asymmetrically. Asymmetric loading fractures vertebrae that would survive the same force applied correctly. The pain from these fractures is often not felt immediately. Adrenaline at the concentrations present during an emergency ejection is a more effective analgesic than most prescription medications. Wind blast injuries compound this. At high ejection speeds, any exposed skin suffers abrasion equivalent to road rash at motorcycle crash velocities. The windmill effect, limbs thrown outward by aerodynamic forces, if not restrained, can fracture wrists and ankles in ejections above 400 knots, even with leg restraints active. The arms are harder to fully restrain. Pilots are trained to cross their arms across their chest at ejection, but a pilot in a spinning, disorienting emergency does not always execute training correctly. The survival kit, stowed in the seat pan that has now separated and fallen away, deploys on a lowering line, a cord connecting the kit to the pilot's harness. The kit descends below the pilot's feet, 10 feet down, preventing it from interfering with the landing. Inside, a locator beacon that activates automatically on water immersion, or can be triggered manually, and a compact life raft that inflates via CO2 cartridge in under 5 seconds, water purification tablets, signal mirror, and a handheld radio. The beacon begins transmitting on military emergency frequencies the moment it powers on. Rescue coordination centers monitoring those frequencies receive the signal within seconds. The pilot is alive. Statistically, they have at least one compression fracture they have not felt yet. The seat fired once. It will never fire again, not because it failed, but because that is precisely how it was designed. A fired ejection seat is not a repairable item. It is a consumed one. Every explosive charge has burned. Every cartridge has discharged. The rocket pack is empty. The structural members that absorb the ejection loads have been stressed to a fraction of their remaining fatigue life that nobody wants to calculate with a pilot's life depending on the answer. The entire seat goes back to the manufacturer. The entire seat gets rebuilt from components that have never been fired. This matters because ejection seat components do not fail, obviously. A catapult tube that absorbed a live ejection looks, on the outside, identical to one that has never fired. The internal metallurgy has changed. The grain structure of the steel has been altered by the explosive pressure wave. Reusing that tube means trusting that the next ejection will load it identically to the last one, which it will not, because the next pilot weighs something different, ejects at a different speed, and the charge burns at a slightly different rate due to temperature variation. The tolerance stack on all of those variables, added together, produces outcomes that early ejection seat programs discovered the hard way. Before this seat ever sat in a cockpit, someone had to prove it worked. That test did not go well the first time. The development history of modern ejection seats is written in rocket sled runs and anthropomorphic test dummies subjected to forces that would make a demolition derby look conservative. A rocket sled test for ejection seat development accelerates a test carriage to aircraft speed on a rail track, sometimes reaching 800 miles per hour, then fires the ejection seat at peak velocity. The G-forces experienced by the test dummy during these runs reach levels roughly 6 times higher than the maximum force on the fastest roller coaster on Earth. The data from these tests, strain gauges embedded in the dummy's spine, accelerometers in the skull, force sensors in the shoulder harness, defines exactly where the seat works and where it doesn't. Early live human tests produced injury rates that would be considered unacceptable today. Researchers and volunteers absorbed ejection forces that resulted in compression fractures, retinal detachment, and in several documented cases, permanent spinal injury. These were not accidents. They were deliberate tests, conducted because no instrumented dummy could fully replicate the human body's response to combined blast, wind, and deceleration loading. The data from those tests, painful to collect, impossible to gather any other way, is embedded in every service life limit and envelope restriction that governs modern seats. The maintenance calendar for an in-service seat is unforgiving. Explosive charges have certified shelf lives, typically 5 to 7 years from manufacture, regardless of how many hours the aircraft has flown. An expired charge does not necessarily fail. It may fire perfectly. But the burn rate of aged propellant drifts from specification, and a charge that burns 8% slower than nominal delivers the pilot to a slightly lower altitude with a slightly longer time of flight before the parachute can open. In isolation, 8% sounds like noise. At the margins of the ejection envelope, low altitude, low airspeed, weigh aircraft in an unusual attitude. 8% is the difference between the parachute having enough sky and not having it. Too old a charge and the burn rate drifts outside tolerance, silently, invisibly. Too recently replaced, and the propellant hasn't completed its stabilization cure, producing an over-energetic burn that spikes the G-load past the spinal threshold. Parachute repacking happens on a fixed calendar interval, typically 120 days for seats in active service. A parachute that sits packed beyond that interval develops what riggers call fabric set. The canopy material takes a compression memory from being folded under tension. When deployed, a canopy with significant fabric set opens asymmetrically, one side inflating faster than the other, and inducing a violent oscillation that can partially collapse the canopy before it stabilizes. The forces during that oscillation load the risers unevenly, and unevenly loaded risers can cause the pilot to pendulum under the canopy, arriving at the ground moving horizontally at a speed that breaks ankles. The 0-0 capability, the ability to eject from a stationary aircraft at zero altitude and survive, was considered essentially impossible until the early 1960s. The problem was altitude. A parachute needs a minimum of roughly 200 feet to inflate fully from rest. A pilot ejecting from a stationary aircraft on a runway at standard seat performance of the 1950s would be launched to perhaps 80 feet, which is not enough. The solution was the rocket pack. Sufficient upward thrust, burning long enough, and could push the seat and pilot to a survivable altitude even from zero forward speed. The first 0-0 capable seat was demonstrated in 1965 at an air show. A live pilot, stationary aircraft, full ejection, and the pilot walked away. The crowd, which had been briefed this was a demonstration, stood in silence for approximately 3 seconds before anyone responded. Now the full sequence, in order. The handle pulls. The canopy jettisons in 0.3 seconds. The leg restraints retract. The ejection gun fires, accelerating the seat at 18 G up the rails. The seat clears the aircraft. The rocket pack ignites, adding 70 feet of altitude in 0.2 seconds. The drogue gun fires. The drogue chute deploys and stabilizes the seat. The barostat and TRU confirm conditions. The separation charge fires. The seat falls away, and the main parachute deploys below 250 knots. The canopy inflates. The pilot decelerates from freefall to 17 feet per second. They reach the ground. The entire sequence from handle pull to stable parachute takes 0.4 seconds for the mechanical events and between 8 and 12 seconds for the full descent from low altitude. The seat is gone. The pilot is alive. Somewhere below an aircraft hangar, a maintenance technician who repacked that parachute 90 days ago will never know it was their work that closed the sequence correctly. The sequence correctly. The sequence correctly.